master's name was Eudy. He used to call me Bafo. Always we were playing. Always she used to play with boys. She used to follow me. Where I go, she was there. Where I go, she was there. It is then that she developed that spirit of playing football. It started there. The whole world knew about her. In sport, she was a diamond, scoring beautiful goals. She was a marvelous, marvelous person. Intelligent, everything. It was a package. Yes, everything you'll find in Eudy. Jokingly, she was playing, teasing others. That is what I miss about her.
For us at the Ujamaa Centre and our partners, it is really important for us to engage with the family and within the context that Eudy grew up in and in the community that she grew up in. I think often within African context and African faith communities, especially, people want to pretend like LGBTI people don't exist, like they're not part of our communities, that they're not part of our faith communities. What this lecture does and why we come to KwaThema every year is to say, here is someone who you celebrated and who was part of your story as a community. And we want to learn from her life. We want to learn from the painfulness of her death. But we also want to create spaces within KwaThema and within every space that we share this lecture and this information, where people's stories and legacies are honored and remembered. The lecture has taken on a life of its own since its inception 4 years ago. We've reflected on LGBTI and the law, LGBTI and faith communities. Last year, the theme was LGBTI, family and friends. And this year we're thinking a little bit about memory and agency. But we don't only want to remember the way in which Eudy died. We want to critically reflect, of course, on homophobic hate crime and the way that this denies life for LGBTI people in African faith communities. But we also, and this is probably the most important focus for this year's lecture, we want to think about how people create meaning and how amidst life-denying circumstances and complex realities, people make meaning and make life. This year we launched the hashtag Remember Eudy. And what we aim to do with this is to create a little bit of an energy point annually to think about how memory informs identity, who we are, but also our dreams, who we become.
The other foundation pursues social justice with specific reference on the freedom, inclusion and equality of LGBTI people. The reason why we have this relationship with Ujamaa Centre by providing grants to pursue this work, it's, I think, the uniqueness in which you can be able to reach to churches using the Bible and read it in such a way that it becomes a transformational tool to accept, welcome and embrace That's why this is important. It is important because not only is it reaching out to churches, but it is also a reaching out to communities. In the instance of Christ, when you remember directly what Christ has done, even though he had gone through a gory path, but when you remember the reason why he had been through that gory path, which has a relationship with individuals as Christians and collectively as the Christian church, that is very profound to propel you to push the values for which he stood for. And in the like manner, remembering Eudy Simelane and many of them, it should also be something we continue to remember, not so that we become depressed, but so that we become inspired to pursue a society that never excludes people, that never dehumanizes people simply because of who they are. And so for me, the Eudy Simelane Lecture is seeking to achieve that, using memory to inspire us for a future that's better than our past.
They said history repeats itself. So now, this lecture, it's eye-opening to the community of Kwatema and the other families that they must not take this thing as a curse. If somebody is a gay or a lesbian or what, if it's in your family, what are you going to do? Are you going to run away? Are you going to kill that lady or that guy? No. Gay or a lesbian or a transgender, everybody has got the right to live.
In a quest this year to think about memory and agency, we knew that we needed to ask someone to journey with us that creates meaning in a different register. And that's why this year we asked the queer writer and poet Koleka Putuma to be our keynote speaker.
I am Koleka Putuma. I'm a Black woman. I identify as queer. Creating is what I do, but I think at heart I'm a creative. And I'm also a dreamer. Like, I am a big advocate for dreaming, for the pursuit of dreams. I guess that's me in a nutshell. So I was raised in the church. I was raised Christian. So my understanding of sexuality and gender was framed through scripture in the Bible, which would later be like wildly rattled by going to a theater school with a bunch of people who don't wear shoes, who walk around in like the wildest outfits, who just come from all walks of life and different backgrounds and different religions and different faiths. I guess going to varsity and moving away from home then started to shift or rattle like what my upbringing taught me about everything, actually, not just about sexuality or gender. Growing up as a pastor's child was interesting. I guess in the moment, I think this has to do with every childhood or every person. You're not really assessing the way that you're raised or whatever. It's only later in your life when you look back and kind of observe how certain things shaped you or shaped your understanding of the world that you begin to decode and unpack what it means. I guess I grew up with someone who moved through the world as a healer, moved through the world as someone that people relied on to guide them and teach them. But I also grew up watching someone have like a reverence and a love for words, because that's what scripture is essentially. And even just the process of like preaching or preparing a sermon is like a kind of a performance in a way. So looking back now, I'm just like, actually, like, I was in the theater, but like theater of faith, you know, because the congregation itself, when I look back now and some of the things that happened there, I'm like, oh my goodness, that is golden material for a play. I got all of my characters from the church. But so much of what happened in the church and how I was raised and what I was taught has now informed the way that I write, the way that I think about the world, the way that I think about relating to people based on how my parents related to people in the church. My focus was on unlearning faith and religion in the way that I've taught it, versus now I'm kind of looking at my upbringing and realizing the things that I got from being raised by a preacher. Queer narratives are often framed by violence or trauma, and it's important to create counter narratives so that people who read or who are audiences that engage with those stories or those narratives have an understanding that queer life, queer love, queer experiences are more than just trauma and tragedy and pain and violence. I think when I was thinking about why it is important to create narratives that counter the ones that we often see about the violence inflicted on queer bodies and queer life is not so much, okay, so I feel like for me it's two things. I feel like it's the balance of, it's balancing telling the stories that reveal and challenge and make visible the violences that queer people experience every day, right? So it's important to create those stories, to tell those stories, because it's the reality of it's our reality in South Africa, right? Like going to home affairs and being married by a state official that bill, for example, was kind of only recently passed. So that's a reality. That's like a kind of violence that we have to negotiate with, right? And so there's just certain kinds of violences that people don't see or engage with that I feel like has to be made visible through the stories that we tell. That's the one part. But I think there has to be a balance of also telling the stories of the everyday, the mundane, the queer body, not always in a state of like tragedy and trauma, because realistically that's also the reality, is that our bodies are not always in a state of tragedy and trauma. We do other things, you know, we have croissants and eggs for breakfast, for example, and kombucha, and you know, like we hang out, we make fires, we go and take shrooms in nice places, you know, like it's just, we are so vast and so multifaceted as people. Our lives are not only this or that, you know, and so I think it's important to kind of tell the counter narratives to sit in the archive of the other narratives so that people understand that multifacetedness. That's not a word, but it is now. Oh goodness, I make up words every day. I guess the key learnings in staging and writing about queer intersections and queer narratives, for me, is about getting in the room with people who who you feel safe enough to get vulnerable with, but also who, you know, like when you get into the room to make the work or to collaborate on telling a story, that you move from a premise of understanding and not so much of having to like explain your experience first before you can get to the work. Well, I always feel like that's an advantage anyway. And for example, when we made No Easter Sunday for Queers, I was assigned 2 mentors, a Canadian playwright, Diana Flax, and a Johannesburg-based director and theatre practitioner, Mwenya Kabwe. And that for me, in making the work, was so great because I was workshopping the play with 2 women who understood my experience as a queer creative, as a queer woman, but also who could challenge me with certain narrative points, and also ask me to go further than, you know, the first idea. For example, like No Easter Sunday for Queers is a written text, but it's also now been staged. And the director for that work was Mwenya Kabwe. And I remember like we had so many conversations about the ending of the play. So when you read the text, in the end, there's a violence that happens in the church where the pastor murders his daughter, and there was another violence that happened. I won't go into the plot of the situation. But anyway, in the workshopping of the play and in the staging of the play, Mwenya kind of felt it was very important that when the audience engages with the text, that they are not re-traumatized, or they are not subjected to another death of a queer body. That it was important for people to come to the theater and not re-witness a queer life being, you know, kind of violated. And so for me, those kinds of conversations are important because I think so much in the creative space, we do things for like the drama or like, you know, for the tension or whatever. But at the heart of why we make work, I think it's important to get into the room with people who are going to ask you, what is your intention with what you are making? Who are you making it for? And there were so many times when she would ask me that, like, who is this work for? And I'd be like, it's for queer people. And then she'd be like, but queer people don't want to see themselves dying. So who is it for? And I'm like, well, it's kind of like a love story, but like, you know, things go down at the end. And she's like, well, you know, if it's a love story, why don't you just make it a love story? And so there were so many like conversations like that were so rigorous that I think can only happen if you get into the room with people who are gonna challenge why you do the things that you do. Yeah, and so in the staging of the work, the women at the end, they don't die. That's yeah, or you don't see them dying. You know, other things happen, and she was very clear on that, which I appreciated. The play comes from the poem that's in Collective Amnesia. The poem is based on my experience of being raised Christian, being raised queer, being raised in the northern suburbs, and then having to go to university in the southern suburbs, and the stark contrast between those two worlds, and how they would sometimes clash when they had to, like, you know, merge or whatever. But also the relationship that I had with the perception of my dad. So when I started to adapt the poem into a play, I really wanted the experience to move beyond just my own. So I wanted to create characters that could kind of draw from my own experience, but it wouldn't just be about me. It would be about the church, and it would be about queer life and queer experiences in the church, and what it means to have the church implicated in experiences of violence. That's what I wanted. But then in the beginning, when I started to write the play, I started to go through, like, I'm someone, when I write, I like to read as I write. So I was reading a lot of researching a lot of hate crimes, and that was the hardest part, I guess, because that was emotionally taxing, you know, to kind of, in the earlier versions of the play text, the opening scene was a news reading of hate crimes. And it's so funny that Eudy's death was one of them. And in the workshopping of the thing, we kind of, that opening scene has now kind of shifted. It's still like a news opening, but it's more specific to the death that happens in this play rather than all the deaths that happen in Cape Town, not Cape Town, South Africa, of queer lives. Because that was also quite hectic to say, you know, in such and such a place, this happened, in such and such a place, this happened to this person, to name these women, to name where, you know, things happened, and to name how things happened. Because also, like, this is South Africa, you know, like, murders here are not just like murders. Like, I feel like we're being gracious when we call the murdering of women and queer people here murders, because they're so gruesome, you know, like, they're actually quite horrific and gruesome. And to wade through all of that in the writing process was hard. If there was a ledger, right, and you're to stack all of the violences together, all of the murders together, it would become very clear to the person who's looking that, at the heart of it all, it's just like there's a hatred for people who inhabit women's bodies, queer bodies, you know, like, there's a common root of why that annihilation happens. I think there's like a black and white approach to the intersection of faith and sexuality that often means that there is little room for nuance or like complexities when we deal with the intersection of faith and religion, or faith and sexuality. And I think it's important when talking about the intersection of religion and sexuality, making work about it, telling stories about it, to bring awareness to the fact that ideas and ideologies and people evolve, or that they are capable of evolving. And part of evolution, or part of that process of evolving, can include processes of education, processes of deep activism, that kind of get people to a point where they evolve their ways of thinking, their ways of engaging with other people. And I think also part of the problem with the ways that the intersection of religion and sexuality have been written about or thought about is that there is like this very dangerous thing that people do of kind of grouping religious practices and religious spaces in like this umbrella of oneness, right? That faith and religion, everyone is kind of anti queer life, anti-queer love, whereas there are spaces that are very open to gay marriages, very open to queer life, very open to, there are worship leaders in churches, for example, who are queer, and that has been normalized in some spaces. And so there are those nuances as well that it's important to kind of talk about and to center, so that it doesn't always feel like, well, it's the church against the queers, because there are spaces where the whole church is queer, or the scripture is queered. And it's actually not even a thing that's out of the ordinary. It just is. And so it's also important to talk about that and to not always, center the other narrative. In spaces where activists or queer people are expected to kind of perform their trauma, perform their pain, to bring awareness to the lived realities of queer life, is that sometimes it's such an unfortunate thing, is that part of our DNA as people or as South Africans is that we have this thing to believe is to see, right? That we want to see something for us to believe it, Like, it's so wild to me that we have a statistic in this country that every 3 hours women are murdered, for example, right? I think for us to grapple with the severity of that statistic, if you were to physically see it, I think it would take you, it would actually shock you into action, actually. And so part of that DNA is that sometimes we feel like we can't convince people, or that we can't bring people on our side and make them back us up if we can't prove that this is real, or if we can't prove that this is actually happening, like, we are dying, I am hurting, this is happening to me, see my pain, right? And then people go, oh, okay, I see now what you're talking about. But I think that we have to get creative or explore different ways of educating, or explore different ways of collaboration where this is concerned, about how it is that we can collaborate with religious or faith spaces, or how it is that activists can start to do that work in a way that doesn't render queer people further, like, doesn't render them, like, doesn't make them further violated or feel vulnerable or like further exploited. I think it's just, I don't know, I guess it's also about not making assumptions, because I think sometimes, often when we go into spaces and we try to do the work of conscientizing or whatever, I think there are a lot of assumptions that go into things, and I think sometimes it's just about asking the question, what do you think you need to come to the party? Or what do you think you as a congregation, or what do you think you as the leader of this congregation need to collaborate, to figure out how we can make the space more open, I don't know. I think I'm also just a big believer in dialogue. I'm a big dialogue person, and I think, I also just think that that's part of our legacy in this country, is not speaking, and also having spaces where other people are allowed more of a voice than other people, and other people assume that they have to speak on behalf of other people. You're actually further silencing them or taking up space where they can actually tell their own story and speak for themselves and actually tell you what they need. All of us have like a built-in savior complex, or have like a built-in like activism complex, which is not a bad thing. I think it can be channeled in ways that can be useful, and sometimes it's not. It's not for queer people to go into the church and be like, we're gonna radicalize the way that queer religious intersection happens. Sometimes it's just as simple as talking, having a dialogue. Yo, this is my reality, where are you? And having a kind of someone to facilitate how that happens, and then go, okay, cool, I think from here this is how we can move forward, and then just doing it little by little, I guess. This is why I also say that I feel like it will take a little bit of imagination and creativity, because I feel like sometimes it's about creating a space where people can feel like that dialogue can happen because so much of our like lives as queer people is like us having also to do this thing of having to tell the story over and over and over, right? To a point where it almost becomes like voyeuristic to a certain extent. And so it's like, how can you create a space that facilitates dialogue and makes it possible for people to bring their full selves and to bring their needs without that voyeuristic weird thing happening, And it could be as simple as just making all of the pronouns in the Bible gender neutral. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't know. I really like this question. Because I feel like of late I've been dealing with, or kind of more aware of making work to remember, or dealing with memory as a way to archive, as a way to not forget, as a way to stay present as well. Again, I think like we live in such a, everything is in compartments, where memory is concerned. So our devices for memory are timeline and date orientated, right? So we have certain parts of the calendar that are demarcated to remembering. So 16 days of activism, right, is our little part there of the calendar where we can do whatever we're doing there for 16 days. And then, you have Heritage Month. There are just so many, like, what can I call them? Like, points, memory points along the way that we are kind of prompted to do the work of remembering while we are living, right? As like a nod to the past, but also to think about where we are going. And for me, the ritual of memory while living, part of the way that I do that is to write, is to archive through publishing, is to stage the work so that there is an actual physical, tangible something to come back to, but also to make it a point to kind of do the work of remembering outside of those prescribed calendar dates, right? So hashtag remember Eudy, but hashtag remember Eudy 365 days versus on the annual lecture, or versus on the day of her death or on her birthday, And so I think it's important to also, when we memorialize people and memorialize events, that we also figure out a way of not becoming clinical about it in the way that it can be with the ways that we've been conditioned to remember. I don't know if this will make sense, but I've just lately been thinking a lot about what it means to remember, to stay present, because so much of memory is connected to the past, or that when we think about memory, we think about going back. And for me, like, I don't know why, but of late, memory kind of feels like a device or a tool to bring us more into the present, to think about what's going on now, Like for me, for example, like if I remember the women who marched, for example, as a way to think about the state of women in this country, So memory for me now serves as a tool to navigate, like a torch. I don't know if that makes sense, but it kind of feels like if memory was a tangible device, it would be like a torch or like headlights or something. I know it's hard, and this is not something that's possible for everyone because we all have different experiences, and some people are not, their families don't know who they are, they live two separate lives. But for me, part of how I thought about challenging faith and religious spaces for myself as my contribution to the bigger dialogue was to start with my family. It was a scary thing, but I kind of felt like that's, but shame, okay, so I wrote a book and then they kind of read it afterwards, but then it kind of opened up a dialogue about my experience of being raised in the northern suburbs, of coming into sexuality once I had left home. And so that kind of felt like a starting point for me. I felt like I could start from that point. Actually, I didn't even start with my family. I felt like I could start from a point of writing, write my story, tell my story, share my story, and then you kind of feel, okay, it's safe to share my story. Okay, like engage with other people's stories, So I think it's thinking about change and shift in little bits. And I think eventually, like, all the little bits will add up where it matters. Yeah, like the intersection of faith and sexuality it's complicated, and there's no one size fits all. A way of working or collaborating or educating might work in this context, but it might completely not work in another context. And I think the thing is to just listen and keep dialoguing in those spaces and start to dream up radical ways of educating and transforming, brainstorm ways that you can start to engage with shifting things or changing things slowly, I guess.